The city never sleeps. Big changes at the top of Citigroup. We'll break it down. Welcome to 3 Times Square this Tuesday from Reuters World Headquarters in New York. Today, it's all about Citigroup. Our power player of the day, the new CEO, it's Michael Corbett. He's the head of the bank's Europe, Middle East, and Africa operations. In a letter to employees, Corbett acknowledges the tough road ahead, saying in part, quote, "The environment is a challenging and dynamic one. Regulatory, legislative, and economic changes around the world present headwinds as we redefine our relationships with all of our stakeholders." Corbett replaces Vikram Pandit one day after the bank announced quarterly results that pleased Wall Street, sending shares up more than 5%. Pandit also leaving the company's board. The bank's COO John Havens departing as well. Reuters Breakingviews U.S. editor Rob Cox joins us from our London office. Rob, what do you make of this announcement and the timing of it? Because this really seems to have shocked Wall Street.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of think that the baseball rules apply here. I mean, if you look over the year to date for Citigroup, Vikram has had 3 real strikes against him. The first of which was essentially his pay package being voted down by shareholders, which, albeit is not his fault. I mean, that is something that the chairman, Mike O'Neill, or the outgoing chairman, Richard Parsons, should have actually sold to shareholders beforehand. But it was a clear black mark on Vikram's otherwise pretty good record. The second one was essentially the inability to get the Federal Reserve to agree to let Citigroup to pay out dividends, the sort of CCAR, which happened just around the same time earlier this year when the pay scandal hit. And so those were 2 really big strikes. Since then, you've had this big, another big strike, which was the sale of the remainder or of a chunk of Smith Barney, the retail brokerage, to Morgan Stanley. Citigroup had a very high mark on those assets that ultimately were arbitrated and viewed as being way too high. It was a sort of game theory gone wrong, which frankly is something that you could accuse Vikram of being of having done throughout his career at Citigroup. He's a very clever man. Sometimes he's a little too clever. And I think that was the case. Now what you have is, yes, Wall Street liked the numbers yesterday, but the numbers were not likable. So, well, if you were expecting negatives and you get a positive, is that really a positive? Because in the end, what we had was a return on equity that was lower than the bank's cost of capital. So I think you put all these things together, it's pretty clear to me that it would have been very difficult for Vikram to have much credibility with his board. He'd lost a lot of it with shareholders. Some of it, again, going back, it's not totally his fault. But if I were Vikram, I would have left long ago, too.
All right, Rob, let's talk about Michael Corbett now going forward. What else we know about him? Obviously, the CEO, as we mentioned, of Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Harvard grad, I believe, 52. Fill us in more.
Yeah, no, I think Michael is I would say Mike is cut of Citigroup cloth, right? So he's been there a long time. While he did, of course, spend some time trading floor at Salomon Brothers, which of course part of Citigroup now. He is not representing any radical shift from my perspective on Citigroup, right? He is not going to break the company up, which arguably is the one thing you can do to unlock value. He is, well, he did oversee a whole bunch of different businesses. So latterly in London, where he oversaw the Europe, Middle East, and Africa, which gives you a pretty good sense of the whole company, right? Because it's the whole business. It's investment banking. It's all sorts of other parts of the business, which is a good stepping point for becoming CEO. Before that, he ran Citi Holdings, which is basically this giant portfolio of crap. Essentially, it is all the toxic stuff that Sandy Weil had bought up over time. In fact, it was sort of the early Sandy Weil stuff. It was unsecured, non-collateralized lending, things like that. It's a sort of runoff portfolio. You have to spend over time getting rid of it. But Michael did a very good job of accelerating that process and getting rid of some of the dross. So he's got a pretty good background in the company. I just don't think he's going to represent any sort of radical departure, and by radical I mean value enhancing.
Well, I mean, you say he's not going to have any kind of radical departure, but he's got the job, and Vikram Pandit doesn't. I mean, so what else can you see for Citi going forward?
I mean, Citigroup has got some really fabulous assets, right? Even though they got less money for, say, Smith Barney from Morgan Stanley than Morgan Stanley, you know, you could argue that they got the lower end of that deal. Ultimately, longer term, would you rather have a business like Citigroup, which is really well positioned to capitalize on global capital flows, which are only increasing between the developed markets and emerging markets? And they have this thing called GTS, a really incredible business, and a commercial and wholesale bank that's quite strong. I mean, would you rather have that or sort of a crummy or second-tier retail brokerage? Definitely, you'd rather have the Citigroup assets. The problem is there's a lot of other subscale businesses at Citigroup. So its U.S. retail footprint is not big. It's not strong enough. It's not profitable enough. I mean, the company would be probably the right thing to do would be to find a buyer for it and sell it and get out of U.S. retail. Its credit card business actually is not that good. I mean, you could do the same thing with a credit card business. You could focus on the global transaction flows, the investment banking, wholesale banking, and you probably do pretty well. And by the way, you'd create a lot more value for your shareholders if you did that. You also have certain areas like, I mean, they are the number, I don't know, 2 or 3 bank in Mexico. It's not making as much money, but if you look at what Banco Santander recently got in an IPO of its Mexican business, right, you can see a lot of value that could be unlocked there.
Okay, Rob Cox from London Reuters Breakingviews, thank you so much for your insight.
My pleasure.
That is the latest from 3 Times Square this Tuesday. Follow us on Twitter at Reuters Insider and check out our Reuters YouTube channel at Reuters.com/ReutersTV. I'm Lisa Bernhard. This is Reuters.